Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the LATAM Stocks Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Flood. Today, I'm speaking with Mack Meyer. Mack's heavily involved with the venture capital and startup ecosystem in Mexico. He's interviewed and profiled some of the leading entrepreneurs and venture capital funds in Mexico. So I'm really excited to get his perspective on what's going on in VC and the startup world in Mexico. I think he's a great guy to talk to about it. So here we go. Hey, Mack, how are you?
Hey, Patrick, pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me. I'm on the
Oh,
other side of the hot seat now.
yeah, right. Like, because you're usually the one doing the interviews. So
Yeah,
now I'm gonna
exactly. No, this
I'm
is
gonna
great.
ask you an interview about your interviews.
Exactly. No, appreciate the time and wonderful to be on.
No, I'm grateful to you for coming on. So maybe give people a little bit about your background because you have a really interesting before Mexico
Yeah,
story. So tell people where you're from, where'd you go to school, and then how'd you end up focusing your career on venture capital and tech in Mexico?
yeah. So originally from San Francisco, born and raised there. Family moved back from the East Coast out to California in the 80s. My parents settled there, and I was born in the city. Initially, kind of my first love was baseball. So I pursued that passion for a long time. From the young age, doing the youth and travel stuff, which is very popular in the US, not so much here in Mexico now. And then moving on into kind of the college and high school realm and finding my way into professional baseball, played for 2 seasons, the San Francisco Giants organization. It was a journey. I always tell people, happy how it went, exceeded my expectations, lived out the dream to play in the minor leagues. The level of competition as you get higher and higher up is smaller and smaller of what separates you from the next level. And it was a great experience. Met some great friends, have some friends still playing. Eventually, then led back to San Francisco, where I worked at a few startups prior to coming down to Mexico. And happy to get into kind of why I am bullish on Mexico and how the inspiration came about.
Yeah, tell me what originally like caught your eye about Mexico because like you said, you played professional baseball, you went
Yeah.
to great universities playing baseball too. You could do just fine focusing on the US, right? You don't have to focus on Mexico. So why do you?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that contribute to my interest in Mexico. First of all, my girlfriend at the time at University of San Francisco in school was from Mexico. So I always say to people, at the moment, you never know how relationships progress. But obviously, we had a great relationship. She's now my wife, and she was from Monterrey, Mexico. But going back farther, a lot of my teammates were from Latin America over the course of my baseball career, from Venezuela, Dominican Republic, Colombia, some are from Puerto Rico, obviously a province of the US, and just kind of understanding their background, how they grew up, kind of the towns they lived in, various socioeconomic classes. You kind of start to see this curiosity, and I'm a very curious person. So that kind of was always in the back of my head. And then meeting Aida, now my wife, you start to kind of put some things together like, okay, I have some friends from Dominican Republic, Venezuela. Now my wife's from Mexico. I started saying, okay, I think there's more to this. Upon finishing my baseball career, I was really intrigued with the next step. Going back, working at a few startups, kind of inspired me to say, okay, maybe what's next for me, and kind of taking this unconventional path led me to Monterrey, where I moved last year after I got married to my wife, who's from here. So I think that's kind of the background of why I was inspired. We can get into more details, as we go.
Yeah, before is Mexico a baseball country? I mean, do they play
I,
baseball?
I I wish it was more. There's a lot of Mexican American players in Major League Baseball, but true born Mexican superstars, I would say there's maybe one or two. Julio Urias, the left-handed pitcher from the Dodgers. There's some other stars that are like first generation Americans whose parents are from Mexico, but I wish it was stronger. As you kind of move here and get to understand soccer is just so strong. In Monterrey, you have the Tigres and Rayados, and that's just the passion. Mexican baseball is definitely second tier. Hopefully it changes, but they have some great leagues. Actually, the Mexican League is probably one of the better leagues to play in if you're not playing in the minor leagues or in the major leagues in the US, because it's still, pretty competitive and pays pretty well. But I wish it was more talented baseball players for sure coming from Mexico. But that's a whole nother
Interesting. That's a
podcast
whole nother
episode.
topic. I'm just curious because
Yeah, we
I
could
feel
go
like
on
in
to
Latin
that.
America, it's either like they're baseball crazy or no baseball. I feel
You're
like
right.
it's
Dominican Republic, which where a lot of my friends were from, is like 6 million people or something, 7 million people, and they're producing like 18 to 20% of Major League Baseball players, which is wild. That's not including the minor league players. So
really
that's small.
18 to 20% of the major leaguers are from the Dominican.
Dominican Republic, yeah. Maybe
That's
15, but like pretty high. You'd be shocked. You're like, whoa, because that's just what they do. But I wish Mexico had a larger portion. I think the league now in Major League Baseball is about 30% Latino, maybe even higher. But yeah,
okay.
it's pretty heavy Latino based.
Interesting. Okay. Well, let's get back to Mexico because I could
Yeah,
talk
yeah,
sports
yeah,
and
yeah,
baseball
yeah.
all day. We'll
We,
get lost.
yeah,
But
exactly.
so tell me about the publication, your website. I know you
Yeah,
interview and you profile funds and investors
yeah.
and
How
entrepreneurs.
how
So
did this come about? Yeah, so I tell people all the time, being a foreigner in Mexico has its benefits, but also has its challenges. And obviously, when I first moved here, basically about a year ago, I started visiting, 6 years ago, but it's always different when you visit for a week or 2 weeks or
mhm.
maybe 3, 4 days. You always see kind of the good stuff and the things that are fun, and you're not really looking for your career opportunities. So I think the challenge for me when I came down here was just building, a network and understanding how the ecosystem worked and who the large employers in tech and where to live and so forth. And my wife is from Monterrey. We can kind of get into the Monterrey ecosystem, I think, in a bit, but it's now
Right.
kind of having this nearshoring tailwinds that everybody speaks about. But it's very industrial and manufactural based. A lot of the largest corporations are here. Obviously, it's about 3 hours from the border of the US, but the tech ecosystem is still very new. So at the time when I moved here, basically late spring last summer, I didn't know anybody. And I'm a very personal person, but there was points where I struggled to say, okay, where am I going to work? Who's like my network? And I said, okay, I
Mhm.
think the best way to do this is to focus on Mexico and try to learn more about the startup ecosystem. So that's kind of my inspiration for VCMX. At the time, I couldn't find a source in English that was focused on Mexico. There's some great resources that are focused on LATAM. But as you dive deeper into LATAM and Latin America, you realize it's like huge. It's like a billion
Yeah.
people, and focusing on everything is super hard. You're doing it with LATAM stocks, but I'm like, hey, I want to focus on TAM or on Mexico and try to find, some startup opportunities and so forth. I tell people the first like month, I didn't get a reply. I reach out to people like, hey, can I profile your startup? And they're like, who's this guy? Right. So
Right.
then all of a sudden I realized, okay, this is gonna be harder than it is, but let's stick with it. And fast forward to almost a year now, I've, met around 40 or 50 founders and VC funds, done some interviews with them, profiled them, really trying to understand what their inspiration was, what's the solution they're trying to solve, what's the problem, and why are they trying to solve it? And also providing exposure. I think a lot of people in the US, and we can get to this, are curious about Mexico and in the LATAM ecosystem, but they don't really, find the resources that they trust, or they don't have a friend that's covering it.
Mhm.
And it's great for you as well. I think, a lot of my friends are curious of reading and listening to different podcasts, but a lot of the times maybe they're in Spanish and they don't understand it, or they're too much. They're not just like quick blurbs so they can follow. So my intention was to kind of build my own network, but also really connect the ecosystem to some of the people that are interested in the United States and San Francisco.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's a lot more interest than most people would expect in Latin America. I was surprised by how diverse it was. I thought it would just be like a niche, a couple equity analysts would follow me, a few portfolio managers, but I get all types of people, just business people, married to a Brazilian and, their kid's Brazilian now too, so they want to follow the country's economy because what they do. So I think you're right. There's a huge pent up interest that isn't really met for English content.
Yeah,
But
and people don't know where to look too. Like
it's
unless they
hard.
have a friend doing it, you're just kind of like,
I
who's
know
doing
where to look.
what?
I do look. There's just not that much. Like there's just
Yeah,
unless you're going to go for like the mainstream media, like they cover it. Bloomberg covers some articles,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it's not the same as someone covering it as a independent analyst, I would say.
yeah.
So what have you learned then? What are some of the key takeaways that you've learned by doing these interviews?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting time to jump into this. I tell people, at my prior startup, better.com, it was already big. I was like employee number 1,000 or 2,000, but I was living in Mexico back and forth during this COVID remote world and following the tech ecosystem, not closely like I do now. Like I joke with people now, it's like all I think about and do. But before I was following the local, TechCrunch and some of the blogs, the bigger ones. But it's an interesting time to dive into it because, as you know, we're following this kind of large deployment of capital in Latin America in 2021, which has created a really tough ecosystems for startup founders that raised during that time, right? So now they're trying to meet some type of metrics to raise their next round. You see this ecosystem that's probably great to start a startup now. Like, you're in this point where maybe you kind of understand like you need to be more effective, reach product market fit earlier. But if you did start a startup 2, 3 years ago, you're maybe having some challenges now as to raise, a seed or Series A round. So I think that's the general theme. But at the same time, there's a whole lot of problems and challenges to be solved as you kind of dive into Mexico's ecosystem. You start to see a lot of infrastructure challenges, a lot of people that are really eager to build, and also some great universities. And I think that's what really intrigued me about Monterrey is it's so close to the U.S. You have these wonderful universities here, University of Tech Design. You have Tech de Monterrey, which started here. And then you also realize there's some of the largest corporations here, right? That employ some of the largest number of people. So you start to see, okay, why is this tech ecosystem maybe slowly growing, or why is it so behind? But it's improving. And I think that's something I do want to say is a lot of the founders I come across will say, Mac, whatever it is now, when I started my startup 10 years ago, you would be like, what is a startup? Like people are asking, why are you doing this? So I think there's one founder in particular that always jokes, if you saw what I did in 2013, you think this is great now. So I think that's kind of the general theme, and happy to get more into details, but that's what I'm seeing is it's a great time to start. And some of the founders that have raised are now starting to see some challenges as capital is pulled back and they're looking for more product market fit and traction.
So tell me a little bit more about the hubs then, because I think it's interesting you have Monterrey, because I think most people that don't know would just assume that it's probably centered in Mexico City. It's the mega city. It's the metropolis. So how diverse in terms of geographically is the VC? Is it all Monterrey and Mexico City, or are there other little hubs throughout the country?
I would say first and foremost is Mexico City in the sense of, when you think of an ecosystem, you start to think of like, okay, where's the capital? There's a lot of family offices there. A lot of the largest VC funds are based out of Mexico City. And then you also have this amazing place, as one founder reference. If you want to build a great team and great company, a lot of people move there from Colombia, Argentina, Brazil to go to Mexico City to expand. You don't really see that many founders saying, okay, my second, hub or office is going to be Monterrey, right? They go, okay, we're going to go from Colombia to Mexico City. And I think that's kind of where the talent is. With that being said, I haven't dove too much into Guadalajara. I know there are a few startups there, but in Monterrey, there is a lot of demand for this logistics and startup ecosystem that's slowly trying to innovate some of these larger conglomerates, right? That have been here for 40, 50 years. They're starting to help maybe pick up from the logistics side and manufacturing side of optimizing their efficiencies within their supply chain. So that's kind of starting to pick up here. But first and foremost is Mexico City. And I joke with a lot of people like, they always ask, Mac, why aren't you living in Mexico City? But I think at the same time, I think it's a great opportunity here, especially with manufacturing and logistics, as I mentioned. I think there's one startup I recently did a feature on, and as I was doing my research, I think Fitch Ratings noted that Q1 from 2022 to 2023, there was foreign direct investment of almost $30 billion in one quarter into Mexico. And like 80% of that was in northern Mexico, right? Driving price per square meter in Mexico City, Monterrey, and Guadalajara up by almost 30 to 40% each, right? So you start to see industrial manufacturing becoming a very big homestead in Monterrey in northern Mexico, specifically from the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And people wanting to make sure that they don't lose some of their largest customers in the United States.
So then the thing you mentioned about it becoming a lot more popular or common, startups and VC compared to 10 years ago. It's something I hear echoed throughout the region. But is startup culture like relevant in Mexico? In the US, startup, it's a niche culture, it's its own thing. And I'm curious, is startup something a college student in Mexico that graduates, would he think about doing that? Or is it still big companies?
I think, I don't have a specific data point to this, but I would say this. I would say that what you're starting to see is people being more open to the idea of entrepreneurship, right? Especially from millennials and Gen Z. So when I speak, students now that are looking at an idea or following, I do have quite a few followers in my community or people that subscribe that are from Tech. So Tech de Monterrey, one of the large universities. So just off that data point, you start to see people more intrigued. I also think there's a cultural thing that it actually is probably an interesting point to dive into at some point on my end is kind of seeing, okay, culturally, it was, I would say it's very conservative here. So people are like, okay, get that job. It's very
Hmm.
stable, little family, and then you can kind of go from there. Obviously, in the startup ecosystem, it's high risk, high reward. It's not stable. Labor is challenging, right? To compensate yourself, and raising capital is tough at an early stage. And I think a lot of founders struggle with if they're not, self-sufficient on their own and can't put their own capital in, or they don't have some type of family allocation that can support them. It's really hard to launch your startup. And that's something I definitely want to touch on here is I think there's a lack of that early stage angel investor that maybe it's going to come eventually as the ecosystem matures. But in the US, you start to see just a lot more people that are eager to back founders early when there isn't something proven yet. Where here it's still, a high risk market, and asset class doesn't have as much interest from those that have maybe the capital. There just isn't as much capital, and the interest in
Yeah.
the asset class is not as much because maybe there's some diversification that a lot of people have wealth here. They want to diversify outside of Mexico, and I think that's
Mm.
a big challenge that I've started to see is a lot of people that have the capital want to say, okay, no, I actually want to invest outside of Mexico. I want to look at other opportunities in Europe or in the US. I don't necessarily want to keep investing in high risk asset classes in Mexico. So I think that's another challenge here.
Yeah, one of the things I've heard related to that is that like the mature ecosystems, most of the reinvestment into like angel investing and early stage comes when there's big exits. So you get a startup and there's now 1,000 people that had shares in $1 billion IPO,
Yeah.
and they go back and invest in what they know, just tech startups. So has
Yeah.
Mexico seen any major exits? And is equity common? Like do Mexican employees and startups typically get shares the
Yeah.
same way you would see in the
Yeah. So
US?
I think that's a two-pronged question. It's a great question. I think, where you're at in Brazil, you start to see this Mercado Libre spin-off for the last 20 years, where people have now
Mhm.
spun off to start their own startup for round two, or maybe start doing angel investing, or now they've rolled into larger VC funds, or Kazakh, one of the largest funds in
Yep.
Latin America, very, very successful. And I think in Mexico, we're still waiting for some of those larger exits. I always reference to a lot of people when they ask about the asset class here is, some of the largest VC funds only started about 12 to 15 years ago. So some of
Mm.
them have returned their LPs, their capital with something, that they've done in the secondary market, or they've had, one or two exits. But we're still, in the very early stage where people are just starting to raise maybe fund two, fund three, not fund 10, right? Or not been around for 40
Right.
years. So I think that's the challenge in the asset class. And the other point you mentioned about, just reinvesting in angels, and I think that's a huge point I was going to bring up is, in the Bay Area and New York and Miami and in the US in general, people have success and then they want to reinvest in the next generation. And I think that just hasn't happened. I think it will happen.
Mm.
There are some angels that are from the US that are investing in LATAM, just not that many. And I think that's the challenge. It's like when you have maybe less than 100 true angels or 50 true angels in Mexico, you start to, struggle with people getting that first check of 50 to 100,000 to get their business off the ground, especially if they don't have, some type of economic support themselves. It's really hard.
Mm. Right, right. So, what are some of the industries then and sectors that you think are particularly interesting? We've talked about, tech in general. You mentioned logistics, but are
Yeah.
there any specific industries worth highlighting?
Yeah, I think, when you look at kind of how nearshoring is really driving foreign direct investment, it's really hard to put away this manufacturing and optimization from the manufacturing side. There's a VC fund here actually out of Monterrey, and they have an office in Houston called Proessa Ventures. It's from the Proessa Group, which is one of the largest private groups here that has a manufacturing arm to it, Atalza, and a few others. And they really specialize in this manufacturing logistic ecosystem and early stage investing, run by Enrique Zambrano. So I think that's kind of where I see some of the most opportunity in the sense of in Monterrey. And I think, as you kind of look at, penetration of internet access, smartphone access, you start, obviously fintech is there, and Nubank's done a phenomenal job of penetrating the market here and giving people opportunities to have some types of lending and lines of credit. But I still think, that is a challenge is, credit access overall is very limited here, which prevents people from, obviously obtaining some type of home equity and building some type of wealth that way. So I think fintech and logistics probably are are the two major opportunities in the next 20 years where you start to see, diving further, you start to see like SaaS and how does that develop here. I still think that's a very tough market. This enterprise level, there just isn't a lot of companies yet that are at the enterprise stage, like the US, where you can go, start a company and have this B2B SaaS opportunity. There just isn't that many customers that are at that point. But I still think that, it's going to grow. And I think that's the cool part in that sense. I think there's one, a friend of mine reference that lives in the Bay Area. He's done some angel investing. He goes, Mac, you always have to remember, we're in the first third of the game here, Latin America and Mexico. There's some people building some great companies. There's some people investing, but we're nowhere near where the U.S. is, or even the Bay Area is. We're in the first third, or maybe the 1980s or 90s or something, where people are starting to get some traction. People are interested in the asset class, but maybe there hasn't been proven return. So I think that is kind of where we're at, and that's kind of the easiest way to sum up.
So the activity, you already mentioned, that right now you think is a better time, and the struggles that some of the companies that were founded in 2021, 2022 had, because activity peaked, right? You can see the number of deals across Latin America, I think the US too, right? Everything peaked in 2021, 2022, and it's been slowly declining. So are you starting to see investment activity come back, or is it still kind of slow and steadily declining?
I think it's slowly coming back, not to the levels that we were at in 2021. And I don't think it's going to get to that anytime soon, right? I think that was probably a perfect culmination of ZERP and people trying to chase returns. And then also you had the stimulus in the US, and you had the pandemic, you had remote workers. It's like everything lined up. I think it's slowly coming back. And what's nice is you start to see some of these startups that have, expanded into Mexico that were maybe from Colombia. There was a recent startup I came across, FinTalk, that does basically A2A payments for fintech, like account to account, and they just raised, I think, a pretty big Series A or seed round of $6 or $7 million. So you start to see that the opportunities for startups that have traction, that have some product market fit, is there to raise that capital. You just don't see people raising these wild rounds without some type of proven traction or some type of product market fit. So I think it's getting there, but it's definitely not easy still, right? By any means.
Right. So let's go back to exits then. So what does a Mexican startup hope for in terms of an exit? Are they thinking IPO? Are they hoping to find a strategic buyer? Are they hoping to, achieve profitability and dividend to shareholders? What does a typical exit look like in Mexico?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I always say is I don't know if I have the answer, but I'll share my thoughts on this. I think when you start to look at a lot of these startups that have reached some type of fit and some type of Series A and beyond, you start to wonder, okay, where is the exit, right? And some of these startups that are now reached this unicorn status, like what's the takeout? Like, how's it going to end? And I think there's a lot of things to be remain, right? Obviously, we had Triple B or BBB go public on the New York Stock Exchange in the US. And then now we have, Nubank that's out of Brazil. But you just start to see like just this lack of IPOs. So in return, I think a lot of people have now shifted their focus. Or not a lot. I think there needs to be maybe a shift of focus on being more specialized, in the sense of, one person made a great point to me is, Mac, a lot of founders should really focus on solving a problem for a large corporation or a very specific niche. Having that corporation maybe do some type of initial investment as a spinoff from a CVC or something like that, and then allow them to have a takeout. Of course, you're not going to have some type of crazy 50x or 100x return on that, but at the same time, you're solving a problem for a company that doesn't want to build it themselves, and they have the capital to eventually maybe buy you out at a lower multiple, right? So of course, everybody wants.
So what do you see then in terms of corporate venture capital in Mexico? Have major Mexican companies embraced the ecosystem?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there's some large corporations that have done a phenomenal job. Immediately, what comes to my mind is FEMSA Ventures, one of the largest conglomerates here that does primarily bottling for Coca-Cola, and then they also own OXXO. They're very active, and they do quite a few investments at the seed stage. So FEMSA is one of the prominent ones. You have Cemex Ventures as well, not as active, but obviously a larger corporate arm. When you get past that, there's a few others. I'm probably drawing a blank on a few, but really what I see, for some of these companies is just they do one thing really well, and they make a lot of money that way, and they have a large market, and the idea or the appetite to have some type of corporate arm, it just seems not that intriguing at this moment. And, in their defense, there has a lot of exits in return. So
Yeah.
why allocate their time and resources, which, it's hard to argue.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the things people highlight to me about Brazil's ecosystem and why it's achieved whatever level of success it has is that the major corporates really did embrace it. And they embraced it 5, 8 years ago for as long as I've been here, really. I mean, Itaú, the largest bank, has a huge office for startups, right in the
Yeah.
financial district. So corporate venture capital really took off here. And that's not something I feel like the rest of Latin America has embraced. I don't feel like I
Yeah,
see
I think
that.
I just thought of one more. I think BBVA, one of the largest banks here, started a program called Spark, where basically they have, this hub where you can come meet in Monterrey, Mexico City, Guadalajara, and they host, startup ecosystem pitch days and investor days. So that's another one that I just thought of right now. But there's a few others. I'm definitely drawing a blank on a few, but not as many as you wish, right, at this point. But it's probably for the right reasons, in the sense that there hasn't been a lot of returns. But I do
Yeah.
think at some point it will start to shift.
Yeah. And what about international corporates, right? I imagine that's even less common, right? That they are investing in Mexican startups.
Yeah, I think internationally, that's a good question. I can't think of any off the top of my head too much. But what I will say, there's quite a bit of active VC funds in the US that are diving into Latin America. And I think that is something that's very interesting. You have a lot of people like Valor Capital out of New York that are leading rounds in the Series A. You have another one, Soma Capital, out of the Bay Area, that has done a lot of investing. H2O Capital out of Miami. There's a lot of VCs that are primarily basing their thesis off of Latin America and these emerging markets. Alter Global is another one. So not too many corporates, but a lot of venture arms, venture funds that are based out of the U.S. that are doing a lot of investing in Latin America, which is awesome to see.
Yeah. So you anticipated my next question. I was going to ask you about the international fund. So let's dig in there a little more. So
Yeah.
where have you seen them focus? Are they hiring an
Yeah.
analyst in Mexico City and opening an office, or are they hiring someone out of college and doing it from San
Yeah.
Francisco or New York? How are they
I think
investing?
most of it is a little bit of both. So it's kind of like this mix, like maybe someone is between Mexico City and San Francisco, or someone's between Dallas and Mexico City. But then you also have funds that are hiring teams, the larger ones like Valor, that will do something in Brazil and maybe have a few people in Mexico City as well. But as you know, a lot of these funds are very streamlined with their teams, and maybe have a team of 5 to 6 people. And now at this point in our ecosystem, or really in our business life, Zoom and virtual gets it done for the most part, and then you can always have that follow up. So I haven't seen too many funds that have that many people boots on the ground in Mexico, but maybe they're back and forth.
So you've started from scratch in Mexico in the
Yeah,
VC ecosystem.
yeah, yeah.
How would you advise any of these international funds to start getting involved in getting deal flow? If they're just saying, "Hey, we get the nearshoring trend, we want to invest in Mexico,
Yeah.
but we don't know anybody in Mexico," what should they do?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. First off, I would think be very specific with your thesis and where you're going to provide value in the ecosystem. I think when you get down here, there's so many people solving some really, really challenging problems. It's easy to kind of chase, like, okay, am I going to be in logistics? Am I going to be in B2B? Am I going to be in B2C? Or am I going to chase to specialize, in the sense of like understanding how the geopolitical challenges work in Brazil versus Colombia versus Mexico? You can kind of get stretched thin and maybe not make the wisest investment decisions.
Interesting. Interesting. So what are your expectations then, say the
Yeah,
next
yeah.
3 to 5 years? If you keep
Yeah.
doing this, what do you hope to achieve?
Oh,
What's
personally.
let's no, well, personally for the ecosystem, right? Because I mean, your bet's kind of all
Yeah.
in on it, so
Yeah.
you'll
What
do
do
as
I
well as the ecosystem.
I think what I hope to achieve is to see a lot of founders continue to attract to US capital. And what I've seen is, as you get past the seed stage into the Series A onwards, you really start wanting to see US funds back you, because it's this like source of validation. And then also start to see some exits from some of these larger startups that have, reached this unicorn status, right? And reached these large teams. So then the ecosystem can continue. And I think and they can start reinvesting. I think it's really hard for some of these founders to start if they don't have the right profile to get someone to back them. Like any startup, it's very challenging, but even more so here at the stage and expand to the United States, which would be amazing. But I don't see that happening anytime too soon, but that'd be, amazing to see as well.
What do you think is an unpopular opinion or something that really surprised you about the ecosystem that you weren't expecting once you started doing this?
This is a question I asked too. Biggest misconception. And now I'm asked, give me a few seconds to think about this unpopular opinion. It's very common. I think a lot of people see this.
Maybe phrase it a different way. What's something you think someone who doesn't know about the Mexico ecosystem would be very surprised to learn?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think most people that are unsure or unaware of how the Mexico ecosystem works would be surprised at how mature the school systems are in the top universities here. And then also be really curious of, okay, there's some great corporations that are making a ton of money, that have amazing moats that they do really well, but you'd be shocked innovations, right? And obviously I compare my opinion and how I've thought of things to some of the largest corporations in the US that are continuing to reinvest, continuing to have their corporate arms. It's pretty shocking to me, and hopefully it will turn, where some of these larger corporations that have been around 50 to 80 years or 30 years in Mexico just haven't really dove too deep into what's coming and what's ahead, just because I think that they're not too concerned with that, because they have such large moats and they have the majority of the market in what they do. So I wish there was a little bit more curiosity by some of the larger corporations around the startup innovation and the asset class, but hopefully that changes. Yeah, I think overall, I think there is a need for more investors at the earlier stage here that are continuing to push the ecosystem forward, take risks, and back some founders. I think that would be amazing to see in the next 5 to 10 years. People, really kind of wanting to push the needle forward to help some of these founders in Mexico launch their startups. And obviously, it's a high risk asset class, but I just think, paying it forward and understanding that, this is the beginning of the ecosystem is part of it. So, you want to make great investments, but I think it's, something comparable as angel investing was back in the Bay Area in the 1970s and 80s. Now everybody does it, right? But back then it was something like, whoa, what are you doing? Like, you're putting a bunch of money into these startups that are going to, 95% of them are going to fail. But I think at some point someone needs to carry the baton and start backing more founders at the earliest stage here. And there's some people doing it, but I hope to see more.
Yeah, your point about the quality of education and the university system is really well taken, because I get that pushback all the time about Latin America. People just assume that, I don't know, that the education system sucks, so people are not as intelligent or not as capable. It's a terrible misconception, but I mean, there's world-class entrepreneurs and operators in these major companies.
Take.
It's a terrible take, but I get it all the time.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these people are super driven. They maybe just haven't had the right exposure to the right people to help them, get something off the ground, or haven't been inspired enough or told, like, hey, this is a real opportunity. This is a career opportunity that you can pursue. So hopefully it changes, but there's some super, super bright entrepreneurs and super bright students in these schools here in Mexico, and hopefully that they get empowered in the next 10 years.
Yeah. So if someone's listening to this and they want to invest in Mexican startups, they're not Mexican, so let's assume they're non-residents. How can they do it? Are there equity crowdfunding platforms that foreigners can invest in?
Yeah, there's a few, I would say, kind of SPV vehicles that have started here. Actually, one in Monterrey called Angel Hub that's done a great job 4 or 5 years ago. They're backing some of the top startups here at the earliest stage. There's also some early stage angel, kind of super angels now that have started some VC funds as well, that are kind of in fund 1, fund 2, very small, $5 to $20 million funds. So I would, suggest maybe reaching out to some of them and be happy to. Angel Hub's done some great stuff with the SPV vehicle. It's still super early. Like, I can't think of many other SPV notable companies that have started that have allowed people to kind of get in for that $5,000 to $10,000 check size in these top, startups in Mexico. But Angel Hub out of Monterrey has done a great job.
Cool. So what else? Is there anything else we didn't talk about that you think we should highlight?
No. Ooh, what else? I think let me think for a second. Yeah, I think, overall, I think there's a lot of people that are curious about the ecosystem. People are now more excited, and usually excitement then leads to people putting investment and allocation and time to that. So I think there's more spotlight on the ecosystem since I've started really covering it last year, but also being interested in the last 5, 6 years, which is great. I just think there's still so many things that are unknown, and a lot of the general public hasn't seen the returns that maybe we hope to see in the next 5 years to back kind of this optimism that I have, or that many people have. So hopefully that changes and there's some more acquisitions or IPOs. But overall, I think that, this is still at the first third of a long game. And hopefully in the next 15 years, we're into the latter third, or maybe my thesis was wrong, but we'll see. I think this is there's tremendous opportunity, tremendous talent, and there's a lot of problems that need to be solved, and infrastructure challenges.
Let me ask you one more like this then. Let's
Yeah,
say
sure.
there's a listener who's similar to you, American,
Yeah.
really interested in Mexico, likes tech, worked in investment banking or worked at a tech startup.
Yeah.
He goes, I'd love to do what Mack's doing. Like, I want to go get involved in the Mexico ecosystem.
Yeah.
What would you tell him? Like, what advice would you give him? Like, literal personal advice? Would you say, hey, have some financial runway and savings? Like, work out your visa first. What would you tell? Go to Mexico City or go to Monterey?
Well,
like, what would you actually give practical advice to a friend that asks you that?
Yeah, two funny parts. I think first of all, the visa challenge. I was fortunate. Obviously, when I was married, I got a visa through marriage. So I think that was the easiest part for me. So I always tell people working visa. But I've heard friends that if they go to their local embassy, they can get a visa. Process is not too difficult, right, in the U.S. Second of all, I would say that your profile will be very intriguing to a lot of startups and funds here. If you're coming from, the finance world, maybe you're on the coast in New York, Boston, maybe SF. Because I think, as you can relate to, there just isn't that many people that are that passionate or in the ecosystem that have the experience that a lot of people have coming from the finance world or the tech ecosystem on the coast. So you might stand out a little bit more. You might come across some amazing founders that will be interested in maybe you joining their team. And last but not least, you'll be amazed at the access. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't really understand. Is I've had my fair share of people ghost me, like we all have, right? World. But I've also had my fair share of people respond and say, Mac, happy to talk. Like, how can I help you? Or, is there anybody I can put you in touch with? And on vice versa, like maybe there's someone I can put them in touch with, or so forth. So I think, being authentic is always important in everything in life. But I think people will be really shocked at the access. Like there's just, a lot of opportunity for people that really want to help and are interested in covering startups, interested in working at VC funds, interested at working at top startups, because there isn't that many foreigners here yet, and I always say sometimes, things that don't look that cool or intriguing at first, maybe that's the time to get in. And then once it's like popular, it's, the relationships in the ecosystem's been built. So I would say happy to reach out to me, reach out to Patrick, that we can help you with some of these in the ecosystem. But, there's a lot of opportunity, and I would say it's a blue ocean in the sense of what you want to do.
What's the minimum level of Spanish you think someone can get away with? I mean, if you don't speak a word of Spanish, would you tell them, hey, man, take some classes, spend some time on Duolingo, come back in 6 months?
I would say, you got to at least have a competent understanding, right? It's funny I say that. I actually am about to jump into an intensive Spanish course in July. It's in Mexico City. It's like 5 days a week, 4 or 5 hours a day, 6 weeks, and there's an option for like a 4-week extension. Because I think, like anything, as you are in the metropolitan areas, people are comfortable and they understand some English. But it's like anything. It's just if you can get by and show that you're actively working on it, they're obviously more open to you speaking some Spanish. But I think get the basics down and figure it out as you go. But I wouldn't have them hold that back from moving down there. They'll figure it out, right?
Make it, as long as you're all in, you make a forthright effort. My experience has been here. People are pretty forgiving, and if you're there and your Spanish is getting better,
exactly. Your effort and time is where you are. So if you get down here, you'll figure it out slowly but surely. And happy to give them a review on the class after I join in another month or so.
For sure.
But I've got recommendations. They say it's a great course over at UNAM in Mexico City. When are you up here? Are you ever up in Mexico?
When am I? I was last in Mexico in 2018 for an industry conference in Cancun. But I've never been to Mexico City. I've been to Tijuana and Cancun. That's it.
Gotcha. We got
due for a trip.
But you're due for a trip.
I'd love to go to Mexico City. All right, we'll do it. We'll do it. It's a quick flight.
Yeah, no.
But Mac, this has been great. This has been great. I love stories like yours, man. I like to see, guys taking the chance and building something in LATAM. It's definitely not the easiest path, but it's worthwhile. It's fun and you learn a lot. And my experience has been
Yeah.
that every couple of years after I look back on, I'm like, wow, I am glad I did that. I'm way better off than I
Oh,
was.
I agree. I've had a lot of points where I'm like, God, that flight back to San Francisco be great, right? What am I doing down here? I keep getting these weird looks. Like, if I get another person saying, like, why are you in Monterey? Like, what is, and I have to explain it all. But no, I think it's like anything. It's, the highs and the relationships you build with people here outweigh those challenging points. But anything worth doing is hard. You can always be comfortable in the US and take the traditional route. But I'm down here and figuring it out slowly but surely, and happy to help
Awesome.
anybody else that's looking to transition. Please
So
reach out.
where can they find you? Where should they reach out?
Yeah,
Where's
I
your
think
website?
my website is just mackmeyer.com, and on LinkedIn, if you just search Mack Meyer, you'll pop up. Feel free to shoot me a direct message. I'm pretty active and will respond. Happy to help in any way, make any introductions I can within reason, and hope you get introduced to the Mexican ecosystem.
Awesome. I will link all that in the show notes as well for anyone that wants to find it
Perfect.
easy. So thanks, Max.
Awesome.
We'll do this again. We'll
Awesome,
catch up again
Patrick.
sometime.
Talk soon. Bye.